February 2006, a new drug called TGN-1412 had successfully passed the animal trials, which meant it could now be tested on humans. It was hoped that this drug would revolutionize the treatment of leukemia and some autoimmune diseases. 8 men applied to take part in a 3-day clinical drug trial, and in return, they would receive £2,000. 6 men would be given TGN-1412 and 2 would be given a placebo. One volunteer would later recall how the doctor activated the needle, injected me, then I began to feel cold. And this was just the start. The medical unit the volunteers were on would be treated as a crime scene by police, with doctors unable to predict how severe the situation was going to get. The 6 volunteers given TGN-1412 would be left fighting for their lives. Hello everybody and welcome to episode 19 of the Students' Verdict podcast. Thank you for joining me on another true crime adventure. To all of you new listeners, welcome, pull up a chair. My name is Emily and I'm your host. If you haven't already, please go and listen to some of our earlier episodes, including the Toolbox Killers and I Represented a Serial Killer. Please follow me on all the socials, Instagram at the Student Verdict Pod, Twitter at Student Verdict, and on Facebook where I have a page and a group for us to chat and share. If you missed anything I just said, links are in the show notes. As always, if you enjoy the show, please consider leaving me a review. If you don't like me, then please keep your opinions to yourself. As always, resources used in this episode will be linked in the show notes, but my main source today is a YouTube video by Real Stories called Drug Trial Goes Terribly Wrong, Emergency at the Hospital. Please give it a watch if you haven't already. Link in the show notes. In the show notes, you will also find links to the Students' Verdict merchandise and my Patreon page. Any support you'd like to give is hugely appreciated. Now, with all of that said, let's jump into today's episode. This case is a bit of an unusual one in that it's not your usual true crime case, but after I watched a YouTube documentary on it, I knew I wanted to tell you all about it. TGN-1412, the drug at the center of this story, was developed by a German pharmaceutical company called TGenero. It was hoped that this drug would revolutionize treatment of leukemia, rheumatoid arthritis, and some autoimmune diseases. This drug was known as a monoclonal antibody. Its purpose was to educate the immune systems in humans into dealing with cancer. It was hoped that this drug would be an alternative to chemotherapy or radiotherapy. TGN-1412 had shown promising results when the study was conducted on animals. But, as we know, all drugs must be tested on humans before they can be widely distributed to the public. People who run clinical drug trials have legal obligations under the Medicines for Human Use Clinical Trials Regulations 2004. In these regulations, it's stated that the following need to be in place before a new clinical trial can take place. The science the research is based on must be reviewed by experts. The researchers must secure the funding. An organisation such as a hospital or research institute must agree to provide a home base for the trial. And the Medicines and Healthcare Products Regulatory Agency, or MHRA, needs to review and approve trials of a medicine and must issue a clinical trial authorization. It was a large multinational research organization, Parexel International Limited, who would be conducting the first in-man study for TGN-1412. Even though they shared their premises with Northwick Park Hospital, the clinical trials would take place independent from the hospital. So, in February 2006, 8 men signed up to test this new drug in a 3-day clinical trial. Rob Oldfield, or patient 007, was 31 years old. He had been back from LA for 2 months, having completed an acting course out there. He was in a bit of debt and signed up to the trial to earn some extra money. Parexel were offering each volunteer £2,000 for taking part. David Oakley, patient 001, was 34 years old. He'd seen an advert and, like Mr. Oldfield, thought that £2,000 for 3 days' work sounded pretty good. Mr. Oakley had done 2 drug trials previously and had found both trials absolutely fine. The third volunteer, Rastay Khan, patient 002, was 23 years old. He had just finished university and was in between jobs. He saw medical trials as a, quote, get-rich-quick scheme and a no-brainer. The fourth volunteer, Ryan Wilson, was just 21 years old when the trial started. I couldn't find details for the remaining individuals who I can only assume wanted to remain anonymous. Prior to the drug trial, some preliminary tests were done on the volunteers, and then they were given paperwork. It was said to be an 11-page consent form which detailed the risks of taking part. There was a doctor present in the room who told the volunteers all about the drug. Volunteer Rastay Khan would later say that the significance of this being the first in-man study was not explained to the volunteers fully. The volunteers then signed the consent forms. So when you have a drug trial, everything should be done in the preclinical studies to limit any anticipated risk, but drug trials are never entirely without risk. The volunteers were aware of this, but they were told that the risks were hives or anaphylactic shock, so didn't hesitate to sign the form. The plan was for the drug company to look at the highest dose of the drug that was without any adverse effects in the monkeys, and then they scaled the dose back 500-fold. The trial was a double-blind, randomized, controlled trial. 6 of the men would be given TGN 1412, and 2 would be given the placebo. The volunteers wouldn't know whether they'd been given the drug or the placebo. Monday, 13th of March 2006. Drug trial, day 1. The group of 8 men had initially been split into 2 groups of 4, who were in 2 different bays, Trial Bay 1 and 2. 1 person in each of the bays would be given a placebo. The remaining 6 were given TGN 1412. At 8 a.m., patient 001, 34-year-old David Oakley, was the first to receive the drug. All the volunteers had a cannula fitted to their arms and an electronic syringe. The doctor then came around, plugged in the syringe, and pressed start. The doctor in charge of the clinical trial was Dr. Daniel Bradford. Dr. Bradford later stated that as a student, he himself had volunteered in medical trials to earn some extra money. Then, when he became a junior doctor, he joined a private company where he ran the drug trials. At 8:10 a.m., patient 002, Rastay Khan, received the drug, but it wasn't actually the drug. Unbeknownst to him, he was lucky and received the placebo. It all started to go wrong at around 8:20 a.m. when patient 001, the first to receive the drug, started to get a headache. The headache got worse and worse until it became a searing migraine, which David Oakley said he had rarely experienced in his life. He told the nurse about his headache, believing it had to be linked to the drug. She got him a cold compress to put on his head, but did not give him any medication or painkillers, as they didn't want the volunteers taking anything that might taint the effects of the trial drug. Despite the complaints from David Oakley, at 8:40 a.m., the drug was administered to patient 005. This was 21-year-old Ryan Wilson. At 8:50 a.m., David Oakley's migraine would come in waves. The intense pain would subside and then flare up again without warning. The administration of the drug in Trial Bay 2 continued, despite the side effects experienced in Trial Bay 1. After the 7th patient had received the drug, the nurse informed Dr. Bradford that one of the patients had a headache. While he administered the final dose to the 8th patient, the nurse returned and told him that the same patient was feeling worse. David Oakley suddenly started to experience severe shooting pains in his lower back. No matter how he laid in the bed, the pain was present. Another patient, patient 003, started experiencing the same headache and back pain that patient 001 experienced. Rastay Khan, patient 002, watched the side effects hit each of the men around him, one by one by one. He watched and waited for the same sickness to finally hit him too. By 9:20 a.m., all 8 men had received either TGN 1412 or the placebo. It was around this time that the side effects started to get worse. Patient 007, Rob Oldfield, began to experience hypothermia shortly after being injected. He described being cold and shaking uncontrollably as if he was freezing, and yet he wasn't cold. It was later said that the patients tumbled like dominoes. The patients started throwing up over and over again. Some fainted, and some couldn't control their bowels. Out of desperation, patient 003 tried to get up out of his hospital bed and leave. He was begging to go home, where he thought he would be safe. Of course, the staff couldn't let him leave. Dr. Bradford described how the men deteriorated as their bodies went into shock. Staff were now out of their depth, with the scene being described as a horror movie. Hours after the symptoms began, Rastay Khan, patient 002, was still sitting in the trial bay, surrounded by men in crippling pain, whose bodies were shutting down. At this point, he still didn't know that he had been given a placebo, and so sat in fear that soon his own body would turn on itself. Suddenly, the doctors and nurses swarmed the trial bay, closing the curtains around the patients who were experiencing the side effects, leaving Mr. Khan alone with only the sounds of his fellow volunteers for company. As the volunteers' health deteriorated further and further, and the situation got more and more desperate, Dr. Bradford called the intensive care unit at Northwick Park Hospital. Up to this point, the NHS were unaware that the trial was taking place, despite them sharing the same premises. When he couldn't reach the medical registrar, Dr. Bradford ran down the stairs to the intensive care unit itself and demanded the first 2 doctors he saw follow him. As their first course of action, NHS doctors advised that fluids, antihistamines and a dose of hydrocortisone be administered to the volunteers by the Parexel team. The 2 volunteers given the placebo, one of whom was patient 002 Rastay Khan, were unplugged and told to go and get some food and someone would be with them shortly. Mr. Khan was still very unsure about what was going on. At 1 p.m., 5 hours after the trial began, the 2 patients who received the placebo were sent home as they were at no risk of any complications. What was terrifying for Mr. Khan was that when he went to collect his things, the ward was empty. He didn't know if they were dead. They were just gone. It turns out that the remaining 6 patients had been moved into one bay, so Parexel was able to monitor all of them as a group. Rob Oldfield, patient 007, recalled feeling worried, but said he still had faith in Parexel. He didn't seem to have realized at the time just how dangerous his situation was. Even though all the volunteers were suffering greatly, a couple seemed to be suffering more than the rest, one of whom was 21-year-old Ryan Wilson. Surgeons soon arrived on the ward and once again drew the curtains around Ryan. Shortly after, they wheeled Ryan away. It was at this point that it suddenly hit Rob Oldfield that something was seriously wrong. Dr. Ganesh Santharalingam, a consultant in intensive care medicine at Northwick Park Hospital, was surprised when his phone rang, as he wasn't on duty that night. As he picked up the phone and listened to what had happened with a Parexel drug trial that had gone wrong, he soon realized the severity of the situation and said he would come to the ward immediately. By 8 p.m., when Dr. Ganesh arrived, it had been 12 hours since the trial began. When he arrived at the ICU, he went straight to Ryan, saying, quote, "He was as unwell as anyone I've ever seen." Ryan Wilson's blood pressure was low and his lungs were very damaged. He had to be kept on high doses of medication to keep him stable. All the men were eventually transferred to Northwick Park Hospital, and the NHS subsequently took over their care. Because there was no space in the ICU, 5 beds had been moved into the recovery area. However, there weren't enough kidney machines. The rate of deterioration in the patients was very rapid, as all the men had multiple organ failure, and so police vans were driving from all over the city with the necessary machines to keep the volunteers alive. Dr. Bradford was under extreme pressure. He had been told that it looked like one of the patients might die, in which case he would be charged with manslaughter. This was quickly becoming a major incident, as there were a lot of unknowns. The patients had unstable blood pressures. Their breathing had been hugely affected. They had organ failure, and it looked like they might have septicemia, blood poison stemming from an infection. Because there was evidence of an infection, there was the possibility that the transfusions had been contaminated. All the volunteers had received injections from a batch of vials made under sterile conditions, but there was always a risk. In a desperate attempt to try and help the volunteers, Dr. Bradford went back and read the document which detailed everything known about TGN 1412. In this document, it stated that there was an unlikely risk of a cytokine storm, which is an extreme immune reaction. According to Google, cytokines are small proteins released by different cells in the body, including those of the immune system, where they coordinate the body's response against infection and trigger inflammation. A cytokine storm is a severe immune reaction in which the body releases too many cytokines into the blood too quickly. Immune cells can then start attacking tissue, leading to multiple organ failure. Dr. Bradford passed this information on to the NHS team, explaining that it was quite possible that the volunteers were experiencing a cytokine storm as a result of the drug. Treatment for a cytokine storm would involve giving the patients a powerful immune suppressant drug and a high dose of steroids. But there is a risk. If they're wrong and it's not a cytokine storm but an extreme infection, giving the men immune suppressant drugs could cause them to deteriorate even further, as their bodies wouldn't be able to fight off the infection. Before deciding on a course of treatment, the doctors on the ward decided to get other medical experts involved. This included Dr. Nikki Panaskaltsis, a consultant hemato-oncologist at Northwick Park Hospital. She told interviewers that she couldn't believe it when she got the call. Having considered the signs and symptoms that were being described to her, Dr. Nikki thought that it was more consistent with a cytokine storm and should be treated as so aggressively. In this case, there was no margin for error. The volunteers were in such a bad way that an error now could kill them. The decision was made to treat the men as if they were suffering with cytokine release syndrome. 1,000 milligrams of steroids were administered immediately. This is considered to be a significant dose. Doctors could then, only wait and see. At 3:30 a.m., David Oakley's partner, Katrina Oakley, was telephoned by a nurse. She was told that there had been a problem with the drug trial and that she needed to come to the hospital as soon as possible. When she arrived, the doctor advised her that David's condition was very serious. He also warned her that David would look quite different. He was very swollen because of the medication he had been given. Despite the warning, the sight of him was still shocking. Katrina recalled that David's face and stomach were huge. Because of this, the patients were described as the elephant men in the media, who, by the way, had taken the story and run with it. The media interest added more and more pressure onto the medical staff, who were trying to deal with something that was virtually unprecedented in British medical history. Remember patient 002, Rastay Khan? Well, he began to follow the story on the news, watching it unfold. He was scared to think of the worst-case scenario for his fellow volunteers. He described it as Russian roulette. He was painfully aware that he easily could have been one of the volunteers in the hospital, but was fortunate enough to receive the placebo instead. The other volunteers were given 2 doses of steroids to try and stabilize their condition. At 2 a.m. on Tuesday the 14th of March, medical staff called Rob Oldfield's mother and told her she should come to the hospital. She immediately started the drive from Bristol to Northwick Park Hospital. When she arrived, he knew how bad he must have looked just by looking at his mother's face. He knew he was puffy. The whites of his eyes were orange because of the toxins. He knew he wasn't well at all. At 9 a.m., Scotland Yard contacted the Medicines and Healthcare Products Regulatory Agency, the government body that regulates clinical trials. Gerald Hedell, the Director of Inspections, Enforcement and Standards at the MHRA, received the phone call from the Special Crime Unit and was told what had happened. Suddenly, this case became a possible criminal investigation, specifically a case of tampering. The original trial bays were therefore treated as a crime scene. The police collected the drug, the placebo, all clinical samples, and the blood samples taken from the volunteers. All of these things were seized and held under the rules of criminal evidence. Dr. Adrian Bristow, head of biotherapeutics at the National Institute for Biological Standards and Control, explained that there was a chance that there was a mistake, such as the drug being mislabeled or the drug being administered at the wrong strength. There was also the possibility that someone had intentionally contaminated the drug. At the conclusion of the tests into the drug's identity and purity, it was confirmed that it was indeed the right drug, the right strength, and was not contaminated. Which means authorities still didn't have the answer to the big question. What went wrong in a routine clinical trial which led to 6 men being hospitalized on the brink of death? For 2 weeks, the volunteers' blood was filtered 24 hours a day. Their immune systems had crashed, and their livers, kidneys, and lungs were failing. Fluid had seeped into their lungs, and they had to breathe air through a mask, while a direct line pumped vital drugs into their hearts. And then, at 8 a.m., on Wednesday the 15th of March, a full 48 hours since the trial began, during a ward round, something truly remarkable happened. Within an hour of each other, each of the 4 patients told staff that they were suddenly feeling much better. Patient 001, David Oakley, recalled feeling things were getting better, and patient 007, Rob Oldfield, recalled feeling hungry for the first time in 48 hours. 2 patients, who had been in worse conditions than the other 4, had been on ventilators, but their fevers were coming down, and it seemed as though, the underlying inflammation was burning out. There was, of course, a sense of relief, but they still had a long way to go. On Monday, the 20th of March, 7 days since the trial began, the 2 patients were still in critical condition, but the remaining 4 were moved out of intensive care onto an NHS ward. Their organs were now stable, and they were unplugged from all the machines that had, at one point, been keeping them alive. The volunteers were understandably hugely grateful to the NHS. Had Parexel not shared their premises with Northwick Park Hospital, the situation could have been even worse. Speaking of Parexel, they apologised to the individuals and their families, but were unable to comment on the long-term prognosis for the patients. There were concerns that the volunteers might, later down the line, develop cancer, autoimmune diseases, and infertility. David Oakley stated that his body was like that of an 80-year-old. His muscles had wasted away after the cytokine storm attacked the cells in the tissue. With this, there was also the concern that because of the drug's attack on the patient's immune systems, that they might not be able to fight any kind of illness, even the common cold, because their immune systems were so weak, almost non-existent. They were therefore told to avoid places like public transport or any places where they would be exposed to germs. Remember Ryan Wilson? Well, when Rob Oldfield went to say goodbye to his fellow volunteer, Ryan was still in a critical condition. He was unable to talk, and his fingers had blackened. 21-year-old Ryan would be in hospital for a staggering 4 months. During his time in hospital, he contracted pneumonia, septicemia, and dry gangrene. His fingertips fell off, and he had part of his foot and toes amputated. What's spooky is that Ryan is still haunted by his father's words. The night before the trial, his father warned him not to take part in the clinical study because his body is a temple. With all that had happened, Rob Oldfield decided that he wanted to get legal advice, so took on clinical trials lawyer Jean Mathers. Having reviewed the case, Jean Mathers expressed concern regarding the amount of time between the doses. He noted that the clients were being injected in quite quick succession, one after the other, despite the fact that the earlier patients were already complaining of side effects. One scientist, Professor Terry Hamblin of Southampton University, described it as reckless, with the 8 men being injected at 2-minute intervals, leaving little time to assess the impact on one person before moving on to the next. Another legal concern was that the patients received the whole drug in between 3 and 6 minutes, which was extremely fast. Mathers didn't believe that the preclinical testing on animals was done at that pace, meaning that in the human trial, the drug was administered 10 times quicker into the bloodstream than it had been to the monkeys. 23 days after the trial began, the government body that had licensed the trial, MHRA, published their initial report. They found that the trial had been conducted as intended and concluded that the adverse effects were the result of, quote, an unpredictable biological action of the drug in humans. The patients did not accept this report, believing that it had been rushed. They also believed that the MHRA were looking to protect themselves, as they were the ones who had given the trial the green light in the first place. They felt that Parexel had been ill-prepared, as they had no backup in the event that anything went wrong, and that the positives hadn't started until the NHS stepped in. The men then awaited a more detailed independent report. In 2009, Parexel settled out of court, giving undisclosed amounts of money to each of the 6 men. Rob Oldfield told reporters that he received substantial cash payments over the course of 2 years as compensation, some of which he used to hire a personal trainer to help him get back into a healthy shape. However, he did not feel that the money he received was sufficient, explaining that Parexel's own documents stated that the drug could cause a cytokine storm, so they were aware the volunteers were at risk. Still, scientists couldn't explain why TGN 1412 acted the way it did. It was believed that although the T-cell receptors in macaques and humans were virtually identical, there was clearly something which meant that monkeys did not respond to the drug in the same way that the human does. It was said that there was a problem with the study. 3 of the preclinical studies gave an answer that suggested that there was no risk where there actually was. It was reported that throughout the investigation into what went wrong, Parexel was criticised for their part. Quote, Parexel's catalogue of errors, listed in the report issued by the Medicines and Healthcare Products Regulatory Agency, include failing to complete proper patient medical records and not providing 24-hour medical cover. End quote. The final independent report into the TGN 1412 trial uncovered a lot of errors, including failure to complete the full medical background of a trial subject in writing and a failure to update the record of one volunteer. There was no contract between Tigenero, the developers of the drug, and Parexel at the start of the trial, and there was only a draft contract between Parexel and a private lab that was involved in the trial. 2 volunteers were allowed to leave the trial before it was confirmed that they had received the placebo. One of the doctors involved in the trial didn't have adequate training or experience, and there was no 24-hour medical cover. It should be noted that Parexel insists it followed all the correct procedures during the trial. The report went on to make 22 recommendations to improve the safety of first-in-man trials. One of the main recommendations was that where a person is receiving the drug for the first time, it should not be administered to a number of volunteers all in the same day. Other recommendations limited the size of the dose and recommended that high-risk trials take place within a hospital with access to intensive care. These recommendations have now been adopted by the European Medical Agency, and it's said that clinical trials are now safer than they've ever been. In the 10 years following the trial, none of the patients have developed cancer. David Oakley went on to have 3 children with his partner. He reiterates the importance of drug trials in advancing medical knowledge. Rob Oldfield now values his life so much more and tries to make the most out of it. What's most surprising, I think, is that in 2013, TGN 1412 successfully passed Phase 1 of the human trials in Russia under the new name TAB-08. In this trial, they used 0.1% of the antibody that was used in the London trial, and it was infused into the bloodstream at least 40 times more slowly. And that's the end of today's episode. Thank you so much for joining me today. The Student's Verdict is a bi-weekly podcast, so follow us on social media to hear about our next episode. The Student's Verdict can be found anywhere you listen to podcasts, including Spreaker, YouTube, and iHeartRadio. See you on the next one, and remember to keep living the dream.